Hi everyone, and welcome to one of our two Willa Cather Foundation-sponsored panels, Willa Cather and the 1920s. My name is Kelsey Squire, and I'm an associate professor of English at Ohio Dominican University in Columbus, Ohio, and I'm the chair of this panel. For this panel, we invited our panelists to share their research on Willa Cather and the 1920s. The 1920s marked the most productive decade of Willa Cather's career. In this panel, we invited the participants to examine Cather's works of the 1920s and their relationship to larger literary, social, and cultural issues of the decade. Topics might have included, but were not limited to, explorations of Cather's first publication of the 1920s, which was the short story collection Youth and the Bright Medusa, Cather's relationship to various places in the 1920s, connections between Cather's writing and other writers of the 1920s, and studies of Cather in light of 1920s aesthetics, culture, economics, or history. And we have two papers for you today. Our first paper is by Nathan Dixon, who is a PhD student at the University of Georgia. His paper today is titled Against Eden, The Paradise of Artful Design in Willa Cather's The Professor's House. His paper draws on the terminology of Clifford Geertz to propose that the Tom Outland section of the novel serves as a kind of dialectic that both magnifies the absurdity of the America as Garden of Eden complex and proposes a national dialogue between those who write history books and those who are often omitted from the pages. Our second paper is by Miguel Ramón, who recently received his PhD from the University of California, Irvine, and is Humanities Out There Fellow at UCI. His paper today is titled Taylorized Time, Fordized Space, and Emotive Aesthetics in Paul's Case. He examines Cather's writing style, and specifically her technique of interruption, and how her aesthetic translates into this new temporal spatial reality and its impact on identity that came to dominate life in the 1920s. So now I'm going to transition to the recordings of individual papers. While we miss being able to have an interactive conversation with the ALA audience, I am going to provide a brief concluding reflection. Thanks so much, everyone.
Hello, my name is Nathan Dixon, and I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Georgia. Today I will be giving my paper Against Eden, Translating the Paradise of Artful Design in Willa Cather's The Professor's House. Borrowing Clifford Geertz's ethnographic terminology, I will argue that Tom Outland, rather than seeking either to become native or to mimic natives, seeks rather, in the widened sense of the term in which it encompasses very much more than talk, to converse with them. The physical absence of Native Americans who once inhabited the Blue Mesa, a fictionalized Mesa Verde, prevents any direct conversation and seems to force Outland into the role of archaeologist rather than that of anthropologist. Indeed, the more learned Father Dushan and Dr. Ripley seem much more interested in analyzing the material remains of the place than they do in the spiritual importance of its physical location. But as Geertz explains, the claim to attention of an ethnographic account does not rest on its author's ability to capture primitive facts in faraway places and carry them home like a mask or a carving, but on the degree to which he is able to clarify what goes on in such places, to reduce the puzzlement. For all their learning, Dushan and Ripley are less equipped to converse with the ancestral Pueblo people than is Outland, who self-identifies as a boy of such humble pretensions that he didn't know how to eat hors d'oeuvres any more than he did coconuts set before him with no hammer. His academic consultants use so-called natural laboratory methodologies to define things broadly, but in doing so they forgo the ability to dive in deep. As Geertz explains, we gain empirical access to symbol systems by inspecting events, not by arranging abstracted entities into unified patterns. In the last section of the novel, Professor St. Peter identifies the superiority of Outland's youthful exuberance when he calls him a boy with imagination who had in his pockets the secrets which old trails and stones and water courses tell only to adolescents. Outland's immersion into the anthropomorphic landscape and his communicative motives in excavating the cliff dwellings point toward the potential for a dialogue between himself and the ancestral Pueblo inhabitants of this sacred and artfully designed place. But he and the professor both fail to recognize that the land speaks not only to adolescents, but also to the indigenous peoples who claim this place and who are in turn claimed by it. Although Outland both propagates a narrative of indigenous erasure and appropriates a native heritage for himself, he simultaneously participates in what Geertz calls thick description when he tries to read a manuscript foreign, faded, full of ellipses, incoherencies, suspicious emdinations, and tendentious commentaries, written not in conventionalized graphs of sound, nor in transient examples of shaped behavior, but in the sleeping material culture of the cliff dwellers who have abandoned this place, and beyond this material culture to the landscape itself, where the materials might finally be reawakened through an active imagination. Though unquestionably problematic, the national inheritance Outland envisions reaches beyond the physical ownership of the material objects. They weren't mine to sell nor yours, he finally tells Rodney, and instead toward a type of responsibility, one which the scientists in Washington shirk, a responsibility that acknowledges and seeks to understand the original inhabitants of the land on their own terms, terms that might persist into the present and thus constitute a living culture. Before I arrive at Outland's attempt at thick description, I want to show first how his metaphors dismantle the idea of America as Arcadia, and then point out the presumptuous thinking that obstructs his nascent effort to translate the world of the cliff dwellers. 1. Artful design. Even before discovering the Cliff City, Outland repeatedly identifies the constructed or manipulated nature of the mesa itself through the metaphors he uses to describe it. Cow Canyon becomes a mousetrack winding into a big cheese. The cliffs on the riverside were fringed with beautiful growth, perched in the air like the hanging gardens of Babylon. The top seemed to be one great slab of hard rock lying on the mixed mass of the base like the top of an old-fashioned marble table. The canyon floor was a mass of huge boulders as big as haystacks, yet piled on one another like a load of gravel. Tom thus invokes human-processed food, human-tended gardens, human-built furniture, human-harvested crops, and human-manipulated railroad construction material in order to describe this natural wonderland. He also comments that during sunset the mesa was like one great ink-black rock against a sky on fire. While these metaphors certainly point toward Tom's futile efforts to describe the personal importance of this place, a failure that becomes even more pronounced once he makes his discovery, and a failure that he shares with Professor St. Peter, as Kelsey Squire has pointed out, they also implicitly refute the notion of America as Eden or Arcadia, the idyllic and utopian vision of an unspoiled wilderness populated with so-called noble savages. When Tom comes upon the old irrigation main, its construction is unmistakable, and the evidences of human labor and care in the soil come across as a sort of message. Thus, the ink-black rock of the mesa, an inscription against the sky, calls out for translation, even while simultaneously resisting this translation through its own opacity. Once Outland discovers the Cliff City, he stands in awe of its artful design. It was as still as sculpture, and something like that, he tries to explain. It all hung together, seemed to have a kind of composition. Only a strong and aspiring people would have built it, he believes, and a people with a feeling for design. That cluster of buildings, he recalls, was as clear in my mind as a picture. By closing my eyes, I could see it against the dark, like a magic lantern slide. Outland paints a portrait of a people far removed from any child of the forest stereotype. He himself is patient and deliberate in describing the particularity of their painstaking craftsmanship, but he simultaneously erases the continuity between the past and the present. 2. Disappearing act. When Tom first sees the little city of stone, it is asleep. The fringe of cedars along the edge of the cavern were the only living things. The village with immortal repose sat looking down into the canyon with the calmness of eternity. There can be no doubt about the absence of the cliff dwellers' inhabitants, but already Outland's insistence on finality, his use of words like immortal and eternity, and his allusions to death reveal a tendency to permanently erase the people who once dwelt in this abode, even while placing them upon a pedestal. What he surmises in this first instant of discovery, the epiphany that flashes upon him, emerges from his own misguided assumptions. I knew at once, Tom explains, that I had come upon the city of some extinct civilization. But of course he cannot know this, even if he has been to Acoma and the Hopi villages, as he explains, and never seen a tower like the one at the Cliff City. This tower seemed to him to mark a difference between the cliff dwellers and the contemporary Native Americans living in the Southwest. But he himself contradicts his further implication that these contemporary natives have neither strength nor aspirations nor feelings for design when he first meets the St. Peters and talks about his time in the Southwest. Although he admits that in some respects the cliff dwellers are, quote, like all Pueblo Indians, he never follows this line of reasoning to its logical conclusion, which is twofold. First, that the contemporary natives might in fact be the descendants of the cliff dwellers. Second, that they might possess some type of knowledge about the cliff dwellers that would rival or indeed surpass the information later espoused by the scholars and proper specialists. Readers previously encountered this type of book judged by its cover assuredness when Tom claims he could tell by his looks that Roddy was a decent chap, though he'd been drinking and acting ugly ever since he met him. Or again when Outland explains how he had never told Roddy just how he felt about those things they'd dug out together, but that Roddy must have known. Even when it becomes clear that Roddy clearly did not know. Cather seems in these instances to question the meaning of knowledge itself and the ability of anyone to know anyone else. Indeed, the commodification of Outland in the main narrative, a commodification that mirrors that of the ancestral Pueblo, renders him unreal and thus unknowable. Tom isn't very real to me anymore, Scott McGregor explains to the professor. Sometimes I think he was just a glittering idea. Glittering ideas emerge from universal assumptions. They are not particular, and Tom's uninformed confidence about the mesa emerges from a general Western presumptuousness. The old settlers said no one had ever climbed Blue Mesa because the sides were so steep. Nobody has ever got into it yet, Rap the foreman insists, because the cliffs are like the base of a monument all the way around. Outland and Blake accordingly planned how they were going to climb the mesa and be the first men up there, never considering for a moment that Native Americans might have made it to the top before them, despite the fact that they both knew there had been Indians all over this country. The emergence of the Cliff City checks Tom's pioneer assumptions and pushes him toward the alternative epistemology of translation through thick description. But before I get there, I want to dwell for one moment on how egregious this presumptuous way of knowing can really be. The cocksure Belgian priest Father Dushan has been among the Indians nearly 20 years when he comes to Cliff City. He had 17 Indian pueblos in his parish and he spoke several Indian dialects, all of which should make him a very good translator. As Outland recounts, Dushan was in fact able to explain the use of many of the implements he and Roddy had found, especially those used in religious ceremonies. But if the religion of the cliff dwellers is so similar to that of the modern Pueblo peoples to whom Dushan ministers, how can the priest assume that the natives of Cliff City were probably wiped out, utterly exterminated? He hypothesizes that the extermination was carried out by some roving Indian tribe without culture or domestic virtues, some horde that fell upon them in their summer camp and destroyed them for their hides and clothing and weapons, or from mere love of slaughter. I feel sure these brutal invaders never once learned of the existence of the mesa, honeycombed with habitations. If they had come here, they would have destroyed, they killed and went their way. Thus Outland's searching questions about what had become of the cliff dwellers, what catastrophe might have overwhelmed them, become eminently explicable for Dushan. His conjecture on complete extermination will be reinforced by what Dr. Ripley in Washington afterward surmised. These men feel sure about things. They measured the heads of the mummies and declared they had good skulls. They were perhaps, Dushan concludes of the ancestral Pueblo people, too far advanced for their time and environment. A time and environment, he assumes, which could only produce inferior human beings. Here, Father Dushan becomes a prophet for the false gospel of progress, or, as Daniel Heath Justice might say, he is all mouth and no ears, a settler with an opinion. 3. Particularity in translation. Although there is no reason to doubt Outland's respect for the opinions of Dushan, he had, we learn, even written out some of Dushan's deductions. He works in a completely different mode than both the priest and the specialists in Washington. For the remainder of my time, I would like to focus on two crucial differences between Tom and these so-called experts. 1. The first is Tom's aggressive curiosity, which manifests through his attention to questions. Tom seems to have internalized Clifford Geertz's assertion that cultural analysis is intrinsically incomplete, a strange science, in which to get somewhere with the matter at hand is to intensify the suspicion, both your own and that of others, that you are not quite getting it right. But that, along with plaguing subtle people with obtuse questions, is what being an ethnographer is like. Although Tom falls prey to the carnivorous myth-making of American exceptionalism, he continues to ask questions throughout his story, unlike Dushan and the Washingtonian specialists. Not only are Dushan's pronouncements entirely absent of questions, they also level particularity to abstraction. For example, after his bawdy musing on the melodramatic death of the well-named Mother Eve, Dushan collapses all indigenous societies from time immemorial into a single culture. In primitive society, he reports, the husband is allowed to punish an unfaithful wife with death. The absurdity of this leveling to abstraction would be laughable were its consequences not so pernicious. Tom's insistence on particularizing the cliff dwellers refuses this kind of stock characterization. Ethnographic findings, Geertz tells us, are not privileged, just particular, another country heard from. To regard them as anything more or anything less distorts both them and their implications. But to hear from another country, of course, one must close one's mouth and open one's ears, a task at which Tom excels and which the Washingtonians prove utterly incapable of. Rather than ask any questions or let Outland explain his mission, the Smithsonian secretary kept telling Outland that he knew all about the Southwest because he had been sent by the Smithsonian to conduct parties of European archaeologists through all the show places. Presumptuous knowledge becomes commodified in the mouth of this man who is nothing but a tourist. Tom is amazed and ashamed that a man of 50, a man of the world, a scholar with ever so many degrees, should find it worth his while to show off before a boy. The secretary's inability to dialogue leads Tom toward a second slapdash ethnographic study in which he tries to find out something more about the kind of people he had come among, who are unlike any people he had ever known. Even Dr. Ripley, who originally asked the right sort of questions and evidently knew his business, ultimately cares less about dead and gone Indians than about going to Paris and getting another ribbon on his coat. The only people in Washington worth talking to are Virginia Ward, Tom's native informant, and the Fritz lieutenant, another stranger in a strange land, who studied Outland's photographs and asked him such intelligent questions. Tom's own intelligent questions spring from his metacognitive awareness, which leads us to the second element that separates Tom from the specialist, his writing in a different hand, employing thick description to translate culture. During their first encounter, the professor quizzes Outland in Latin and Spanish, then, satisfied with the young man's mastery of foreign languages, inquires into his deficiencies. I never had any mathematics or science, Tom responds, and I write a very bad hand. Here, under the watchful eye of the professor, whom we should consider another specialist, the act of writing becomes linked to mathematics and science. But as Geertz points out, and as Tom well knows, in ethnography it is not possible, though there are those who try, to isolate the Y's from the X's to write a proper function. This setting forth of what Geertz calls symmetrical crystals of significance recalls Rodney's classification of education as some kind of hocus pocus that enabled men to live without work, a definition that suits the Washington specialist who grub for European vacation money and who will do almost anything for a good lunch. Geertz argues that ethnography is not an experimental science in search of law, but an interpretive one in search of meaning, and there is nothing in the world Tom Outland is after if not meaning. The tower was the fine thing, he reports upon first viewing the Cliff City, that held all the jumble of houses together and made them mean something. In the end, Tom's bad hand becomes in the professor's memory a fine, long hand which had never handled things that were not the symbols of ideas. This hand, sprung from a mind questioning after meaning, records the process of what Outland and Roddy call excavating, writing down just where and in what condition they had found their specimens and what they thought they had been used for. I'd got a merchant's ledger in Tarpon, Tom explains, and every night after supper, while Roddy read the newspapers, I sat down at the kitchen table and wrote up an account of the day's work. It is this willingness to work, this ethic of mindful deliberation, this desire for discourse that the specialists lack. They prefer abstract hocus pocus, or the appearance of it, to concrete labor. If you want to understand what a science is, Gertz explains, you should look at what the practitioners of it do. And what does the ethnographer do? The ethnographer inscribes, he says. He writes it down. St. Peter finds in Tom's journal a minute description of each tool they found, of every piece of cloth and pottery, frequently accompanied by a very suggestive pencil sketch of the object and a surmise as to its use and the kind of life in which it had played a part. The adjectives were purely descriptive, relating to form and color, and were used to present the objects under consideration, not the young explorer's emotions. Yet through this austerity one felt the kindling imagination, the ardor and excitement of the boy. It is through his imagination that Tom finally turns away from appropriation. I'd as soon have sold my own grandmother as Mother Eve, he tells Rodney, refusing to claim the native lineage that he had previously hinted at. Rodney's response that Tom is a way out of his depth points us back toward the kind of intellectual effort that defines ethnography, an elaborate venture in thick description, which has everything to do with depth. We finally see Tom moving beyond the need of his record altogether as he himself becomes a part of the land, claiming it, yes, but no more than it claims him, which is the real test of kinship, a kind of reciprocal inscription. Earlier in the book, though later in Tom's chronology, we see him writing again when he spends innumerable hours with the professor's daughters making Hopi villages with sand and pebbles, drawing maps of the painted desert in the Rio Grande country and the gravel, and telling them stories. Ultimately, Tom succeeds in that most famous of all modern mandates. He had made something new in the world, the professor recalls, and the rewards, the meaningless, conventional gestures he had left to others. This newness, though, springs from discovering the wellspring of the old. What is most modern in our time, Guy Davenport reports, frequently turns out to be the most archaic. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Miguel, and thank you for your interest in our Cather panel, specifically my presentation, Aesthetics that Interrupt, Feelings in Taylorized Time and Fordized Space in Cather's Paul's Case. In 1924, Willa Cather replied to a letter from F. Scott Fitzgerald in which he lessens his fear regarding the similarities between passages from his upcoming novel, The Great Gatsby, and her novel, The Lost Lady. Fitzgerald described the style in his book as, quote, altogether something new, yet feared key passages from Gatsby would seem plagiaristic of Cather's work. It is understandable, as both texts feature moments that break from traditional narrative techniques to deploy emotion to develop the protagonist's identity through feelings created in the reader through imagery, rather than detailing events that happen to the novel's protagonist. This new form of characterization, a modern aesthetics of interruption, creates imagistic passages that slow down the reader to reach an audience transformed by a culture's rapid transformation during the Second Industrial Revolution. In fact, the aesthetics arises as a cultural logic of Fordism and Taylorism moves beyond the factory floor and into society's leisure and cultural spaces, influencing reading habits and writing styles. Perhaps Fitzgerald's concern sprang from more than just this specific passage, but his broader adoption of Cather's aesthetic innovation, technique demonstrated in Paul's Case, A Study in Temperament, published in McClure's magazine in 1905. In her response to Fitzgerald, Cather described their similarity of writing style, a technique in which authors interrupt traditional reading modes by writing in effective registers. Quote, the effect is greater than the cause. The cause or the emotive approach the author employs is brief, but by using stylistics that slow down the reader, the author targets her audience by creating genuine feelings that happen to lived experiences, originating from the new social practices ushered in by Taylorized time and Fordized space. In fact, Paul's Case highlights the style and aesthetic of interruption that details the reach of Fordized Taylor's thinking outside of the factory as it helps refashion key institutions in American life, school and home. Paul's High School is no longer the single teacher schoolhouse, but a Fordized space that treats students as raw goods whose centralization increases the efficiency of their educational transformation. Paul's initial characterization comes not through direct action, but centralized efficiency, Paul's dramatic disciplinary hearing. Next, the reader comes to understand Paul's essential conflict, facing the challenges of heteronormative pressure, not through the plot, but rather through the house's descriptions and Paul's feelings. The mass-produced brownstone of Cordelia Street, built with prefabricated construction and rationalized labor, rationalized labor, creates the central image of the closeted space that confronts Paul. By detailing how Cather's lived experience of Fordism and Taylorism, I can trace the forces that help fashion the aesthetics of interruption that is the early hallmark of Cather's modern style. The hallmark of Cather's early modern style. I got that backwards, excuse me. As Fordism and Taylorism become more integral to daily life, functioning in what Jameson terms a cultural dominant, these forces restructure the emotional lives of workers, providing Cather the stylistic space to produce a modern aesthetic. Fordism and Taylorism in Pittsburgh. America's transformation from the Second Industrial Revolution featured the largest migration in American history. Within a generation, American rural life had given way to the towns and cities that constructed the modern American character. In just 40 years, the urban population increased 4 times, while the rural population only doubled. In 1900, an American was 20 times more likely to move from the farm to the city than vice versa. The 1920 census declared that for the first time, a majority of Americans lived in the city. Pittsburgh best exemplifies this transformation in the early 20th century. Between 1890 and 1900, the 3 river areas of Pittsburgh that were known as the 3 river areas of Pittsburgh known as the City of Work, whose, quote, Golden Triangle, provided the economic foundation for Pittsburgh's rapid development, from a centralized education system to a diversifying economy, which includes magazine publication, home offices, and advertising houses. 2 forces engineered this transformation. Fordism, a centralization of space depicted by the iconic assembly line or the skyscraper, emerges in Carnegie's steel mills, as well as the philanthropic efforts throughout the city. Taylorism, or the use of time management to create efficiencies in work, moves the bell schedule of the factory into the school. These 2 forces interact with Cather and the rest of Pittsburgh as their influence spread through the culture at large. Before writing Paul's case, Cather was part of the publishing world's restructuring by the Taylorist Fordist logic. Advertising created an economic incentive to develop and sustain publications that could deliver an audience for the emerging corporations, while they mass produce all kinds of products that offer a bit of the good life from purchase. Starting in 1893, Cather began submitting short stories for publication. By 1896, Cather started writing and editing for the Home Monthly, working as both a writer and editor for the Home and Fireside magazine. The Home Monthly was intended to compete for the same audience as the Ladies' Home Journal, and Cather used pseudonyms to write for it. Cather was essential in getting the magazine launched, including manuscript reading, blocking for the issues, and corresponding with authors. Cather complained in a letter to her friends that the magazine was, quote, trash, but trash that people apparently wanted to read. Cather had to learn how to target this audience to sell various products to sustain the magazine's revenue. This practice undoubtedly influenced the fiction she would have published in other national periodicals during that same period. In 1900, Cather published Eric Hermanson's Soul in Cosmopolitan. By 1901, Cather published Jackaboy in the nation's advertising showcase, the Saturday Evening Post. By 1906, she was working as an editor and fiction writer for McClure's magazine. And all that is to simply say that she's at the moment these new forms of advertising are emerging. She's writing and editing the fiction that's going to be both the production and motivation for consumption of these periodicals. It has to shape the kind of choices she definitely makes. But Cather's personal experience with national magazine production, marketing speaks to the broader relationship in the emergence of national periodicals and the more significant issues of Fordism's tendency for overproduction. Jolly, who details advertising's evolution, explains its importance in stabilizing the economy by delivering a readership for corporations. Give me 2 seconds. I got a little clip for you.
When industrial capitalism came into its own in the late 19th and early 20th century, the effects were nothing short of revolutionary. Never before had the world seen the sheer quantity of commodities that industrial factories were now producing. In fact, one of the first economists to try to make sense of capitalism, Karl Marx, observed that what distinguished capitalism from all previous economic and social systems was its ability to produce what he called an immense accumulation of commodities. But for capitalism to survive and grow as a system, production alone would not be enough. At its core, capitalism depends on commodities going through a 3-part circuit of production, distribution, and consumption. Production had been solved by labor and cost-saving advances in industrial technology, easy access to raw materials and energy sources, and by hiring cheap, low-wage workers who didn't yet have any labor rights. And distribution had been solved by new modes of transportation that enabled factory owners to easily distribute their goods to buyers and retail outlets across great distances. All that remained was the problem of consumption, the challenge of making sure people bought things they didn't actually need. The jeopardy to capitalism as a system was real. If consumption failed to keep pace with production and distribution, then capitalism as a system could collapse under the weight of overproduction, a casualty of too many goods chasing too few buyers. And so, on pain of death, as a matter of pure survival, in the middle of the 19th century, capitalism invents an entirely new industry to save itself. It invents the advertising industry, brings supply and demand into greater synchronicity.
I'll get back to my slideshow here, guys. All right. Make sure you can see my screen. I don't want to make I'm sure we've all made that error enough. Good. Cather's work for the Home Journal and McClure's is part of an emerging process of national periodical production spurred by advertising. It's not simply that advertising pays the bills, but the need to get readers to stop and read the articles, and more importantly, see the ads, drives copywriters and editors to make choices to interrupt page turning. The more efficient writers and advertisers slowed down the reader during the great speed up of the earliest 20th century. This reality cannot help but influence the writing of national periodicals themselves, and Cather in particular. Another example is of this larger influence, moving beyond the factory floor, occurs by looking at Ford himself. In a biography that focused on Ford's public image, Ford's public image, in a biography that focused on Ford's public image, David Lewis describes how Ford's famous $5 plan influenced more than simply the worker. In his work, Lewis offered interesting insight into the public relations side of Ford's operation. In the week following the publicizing the plan, Lewis pointed out that New York press devoted 52 columns to Ford and his profit-sharing plan. Moreover, nationally, the story received more than 2 million lines of favorable advertising on the front page of newspapers and thousands of editorial endorsements. Lewis concluded that, quote, $5 day was an economic second coming to the emerging national periodic market. And I just wanted to give us a specific example of the kind of larger practices from when we think about large economic forces like Fordism, how it becomes a lived experience is harder to understand. But by putting Cather inside a magazine production process that's now dictated by advertising that's showcasing these products, we can then get a sense of how this is going to shape her writing. The writing was not the only way economic processes shaped Cather. Her time inside Pittsburgh's education system provided the lived experience of factory education. Cather worked from 1901 to 1906 at Central High and Allegheny High Schools. In 1884, Pittsburgh School Board transformed traditional decentralized education into a consolidated high school and centralized school system. Raymond E. Callahan, in his book In Education and the Cult of Efficiency, describes how schools like Cather worked. Quote, our schools are in a sense factory in which the raw product, children, are to be shaped and fashioned into products to meet the various demands of life. The specifications for manufacturing come from demands of 20th century civilization, and it's the business of the school to build its pupils according to the specifications laid down. Cather attempted to bridge the factory on kids, often meeting with groups of students outside of class or for tea. Nevertheless, her time as a teacher not only provided experience to students like Paul when they faced the consequences of quote-unquote infractions, but would have made sure each area of Cather's life in Pittsburgh was full of Fordist and Taylor's practices. In addition to her work at the Ladies' Home Journal and Fordized education system, the city of Pittsburgh demonstrated the impact of the industrial logic when moving beyond the factory floor into its neighborhood design. Aurelia Street, most likely the inspiration for Cordelia Street, is one of the earliest examples of Fordist Taylor's home construction. The result, identical homes on an identical street. A street Cather would often walk through working on her way to work from her home to the home monthly. You can see in the images on the right and the left, the houses are identical, and this is the long row of the houses we are now uber used to seeing images of mass reproduced homes for efficiency. It's something that we are used to. It was something brand new in Pittsburgh in America when Cather was there writing. As Martha Bantu notes in Taylorized Lives, narrative production in the age of Taylor, Vemblin, and Ford, advertising for mass-produced homes skyrocketed during the early 20th century. The house had become a locus for the family to express their change and transformation in becoming modern. Magazines like the Ladies' Home Journal or Cather's Home Monthly ran advertising for the earliest versions of these kits. Home building kits offered economic mobility in a box, my favorite tagline from these adverts, made possible through rationalized production that lowered the cost of the home. By 1920, uniformity in home design had become so widespread as to be satirized in films like Buster Keaton's One Week, farcical look at family transformed by a larger cultural logic. Cather's emergence as a fiction writer occurs when America is rationalizing time and centralizing space, a change that alters the audience's perception and experience of time. As a logic of hurrying up, Taylorism, while staying still, Fordism, centralized, extends into school and family. The prose produced reflects these influences. Cather's aesthetic emerges to target this audience by speaking this new language, one of interruption, an audience whose work life features repetitive moments that reduce the interest in traditional narrative forms and instead find aesthetics that speak a new language of image and time interruption to counter the increasing rush from daily life. Paul's case features the same influences that reflect Cather's life in Pittsburgh. Still, more than simply including them thematically, the text features a stylistic expression of Fordism and Taylorism's reimaging of time and a notion of identity. Cather translates these forms into the stylistics that make Paul's case not a traditional narrative, but a study and relationship between identity and feeling during the Second Industrial Revolution. The story begins with this interruption. Quote, "It was Paul's afternoon to appear before the faculty of Pittsburgh High School to account for his various misdemeanors. Instead of introducing Paul through an actual account of Paul's recent behavior, Cather's opening takes advantage of the centralized scene in which to prefabricate Paul's character, Paul's appearance before the faculty regarding his suspension. This meeting occurs at a centralized high school, a factory-like setting in which workers or students are increasingly managed by middle management teachers. Not only are centralized high schools a dramatic shift from the one-room schoolhouse, but their very structure makes sure the reader understands Paul as defective. And the meeting almost becomes a moment of quality control to see if the damaged product can be salvaged. Paul's behavioral issues, which the first line of the story calls misdemeanors, are presented in one setting. The educational factor becomes a way to interpret the reader, expecting the events to be detailed. The story opens instead with an image full of interruption of Paul itself. Quote, "Paul entered the faculty room, suave and smiling. His clothes were a trifle outgrown, and the tan velvet of the collar of his open overcoat were frayed and worn. But for all that, there was something of the dandy about him, and he wore an opal pin in the neatly knotted black four-in-hand, and a red carnation in his buttonhole. This latter adornment, the faculty somehow felt was not properly significant of the contrite spirit befitting a boy under the ban of suspension. Paul was tall for his age and very thin, with high, cramped shoulders and a narrow chest. His eyes were remarkable for their certain hysterical brilliancy, and he continually used them in a conscious, theatrical sort of way, peculiarly offensive in a boy. The pupils were abnormally large, as though they were addicted to belladonna, but there was a glassy glitter about them which the drug does not produce. Paul's image, one that challenges the gender norms of the time, becomes criminalized not because of his actions themselves, but the nature of the narrative technique. The image depicts Paul takes advantage of the student's expectation in the educational factory, conformity, uniformity in production. But Cather wants the reader to feel Paul as contrary more than simply understand Paul as outside of the rigid norms that the factory is intended to produce. Cather leverages the factory setting, using its emotive power to replace its actual deeds with an image of Paul as defective, wearing frayed and outgrown clothing, trying to hide his narrow chest and his hysterical eyes. Paul's misdemeanors or defects are understood through the feeling created in the reaction of Paul and not his actual behavior. Paul's imagery, a bit of the dandy, slows down the reader and produces a feeling that the brief narrative description itself couldn't sustain. So the reader feels something more about Paul than knows something about him. And this is going to be a motif that she continually creates through interruption. Instead, the teacher as factory worker seeing Paul allows Paul's image to create another interruption, one that speaks to the reader's own experience of repetition. The factory-like school takes advantage of centralization to enable workers to produce the same physical action repeatedly. Taylorism produces efficiency through this repetition. Paul's body reflects the impact of his strange repetition. Quote, his lips were continually twitching, and he had a habit of raising his eyebrows that were contemptuous and irritating to the last degree. Paul's lip twitch and eyebrow wiggle, like Gatsby's gyrating legs in The Great Gatsby, seemingly move for no narrative reason. During this meeting, and perhaps through the school day, Paul's lip twitch is a physical expression of how identity fabrication works, why these conforming forces are created. The interruption reinforces the feeling that the opening scene produces, a sense understood through Paul's affect, that the reader can associate through the twitching in their own lives. So Cather is taking advantage of this random twitch that makes no real sense in order to give us a kind of reflection, a kind of moment that we could all, if we were the readers in 1905, relate to. And this new constant repetition produces all kinds of twitching. It's kind of an echo of Fordized Taylor's practice. With the audience feeling Paul's irregularity, Cather continues to use stylistics to slow down the reader and produce another feeling, from defect to revulsion. After Paul leaves the factory-like school, he works as an usher at Carnegie Hall. Paul could have any number of after-school jobs, but working at Carnegie Hall taps into an association of steel-bearerness during the time. Carnegie's cultural philanthropy arises as a direct result of his celebrated efficiencies. This association helps interrupt the narrative to see Paul's house and continue to produce feeling about Paul in the reader. Quote, he approached it tonight with the nevertheless sense of defeat, the hopeless feeling of sinking back forever into the ugliness and commonness they've always had when he came home. The moment he turned into Cordelia Street, he felt the waters close above his head. After each of these orgies of living, he experienced all the physical depression which follows a debauch, the loathing of respectable beds, of common food, of house penetrated by kitchen odors, a shuddering repulsion for the flavorless, colorless mass of everyday existence, a morbid desire for cool things and soft lights, fresh flowers. The irregular use of words themselves creates the interruption in this passage, the contradiction between loathing yet respectable and odors that penetrate the kitchen rather than originating from the kitchen slow down the reader. The reader has the image of what home should be, and this home's uniformity allowed Paul's irregularity to stand out. Paul's feeling of sinking back is just that, a feeling. One at the turn of the century reader too has experienced with growing regularity in their daily lives. Moreover, Cather uses this moment to introduce a recurring image of steel production Cather eventually will make for Paul, the faggoting of steel. And what I mean by that is it's the process by which steel is the innovations going on in Pittsburgh at the time produced. Steel is now being mass produced in a Bessemer, which I'll talk about in a second. And that this Bessemer uses a heating and cooling process of hot iron ore introduced into water, a lowering and raising, a sinking and returning. And I think this is the essential image that slows us down inside the text. I'll continue. Carnegie's innovations in mass producing uniform steel are essential in the social transformation of the time. Steel becomes the integral foundation for the Industrial Revolution and requires a cool bath to harden and to remove impurities from iron in the steel process. The water that rushed over Paul in this passage will be a repeated image with Paul. Cather eventually will end the story by making this association explicit. She will eventually write, Paul burnt like a faggot in a tempest. But in this early interruption, the water is part of several narrative contradictions that build a feeling without narrative cause. It's as if the defects detected in the factory of the school are brought out by Carnegie's halls of orgy of living, heated up by the debauch, and can now be purified by the waters or colorless mass of rationalized homes. While the aesthetics of interruption work for the story, the last image I wish to analyze, or the central image I wish to analyze, is the powerful image of a steel furnace to produce character from feelings and their associations. In the most critical passage of the story, Cather almost names Paul's homosexuality. This tip of the iceberg occurs as Paul has stayed out too late from work and sneaks into his home's basement to avoid being detected by his father. Because of rationalized time, the story states, he was so much, quote, quote, he was so much later than usual that there would certainly be inquiries and reproaches. Paul's home is run like a factory, with regular schedules and time men with stopwatches constantly monitoring for inefficiencies. Paul avoids his father playing floor manager by crawling into the basement. Here is the complete passage. Meanwhile, he was wet and cold. He went around to the back of the house and tried at the basement windows, found it open, raised it cautiously, and scrambled down the cellar wall to the floor. There he stood, holding his breath, terrified by the noise he had made, but the floor above him was silent and there was no creak on the stairs. He found a soapbox and carried it over to the soft ring of light that streamed from the furnace door and sat down. He was horribly afraid of rats, so he did not try to sleep, but sat looking distrustfully at the dark, still terrified lest he might have wakened his father. Such reactions after one of the experiences which made days and nights out of the dreary blanks of the calendar. But when his senses were deadened, Paul's head was always singularly clear. Suppose his father had heard him getting into the window and came down and shot him for a burglar. Then again, suppose his father had come down pistol in hand and he cried out to save himself, and his father had been horrified to think how nearly he had killed him. Then again, suppose the day should come when his father would remember that night and wish there had been no warning cry to stay his hand. With this last supposition, Paul entertained himself until daybreak. The end of the passage forces the reader to become Paul and slow down to be entertained with the notion of Paul's father killing Paul. The three suppositions ask reader to answer an essential question. What could Paul's father in the future learn about his son's behavior now that he would wish his son to be dead? The severity of the contradiction, father's would-be love for the sons turned into hate, creates this pause. How can a father who must certainly love his son eventually desire his son to be dead? The reader must consider only a few possible options. The most likely, of course, is Paul's homosexuality. And this is here's a side teaching moment. When I teach this text, this is the very first thing I start with before we ever get into the text itself. We talk about what would reasons why a father might wish his son dead, because it's such an essential passage. We've got to unpack it before we get to it. That's a normal teaching moment. The stigma attached to Paul's sexuality identity becomes all the more severe through the interruption. The reader feels Paul's growing understanding of Paul's own identity as it's becoming known and understood as defective. The defect signaled by the red carnation and the feeling of rejection expressed by the faculty help the reader understand through feeling. But the passage does not out Paul. It takes advantage of the feelings produced by Taylorized and Fordism to allow the reader to feel the heteronormative pressure at work. And you could argue there's something particularly brilliant about that as a way of getting at the thing you're not allowed to speak. With the ending of the passage discussed, I want to read the image that produces it closely. A furnace of the mass-produced basement house, which invokes steel furnaces that could both literally and figuratively power Pittsburgh. Paul enters this basement wet and cold, which is a continuation of the imagistic association with steel faggoting process. The scene, which ends in the ruminations, begins by slowing down the reader with "meanwhile," and "there he stood, holding." The pause slows the would-be page turn, allowing the reader to focus on the image that follows. Paul sitting next to, quote, the soft ring of light that streamed from the furnace door. Paul's basement as a closeted space can only be seen through this proximity to the house's furnace. Despite the factory house being closed, its engine continually burns, slowly but persistently purifying Paul. Papers from New York to Pittsburgh to San Francisco would be full of this image, sketches and early photographs depicting the latest innovation development of the steel producing furnace. Here's an example of the images being published as part of a larger cultural celebration in the growth of rapid production of steel. The story in the New York Post in 1901 details the steelmaking process. The image taken in Pittsburgh, the one on the right, is circa 1890, and it features the evolution of the Bessemer converter, or large furnace that uses oxidation to remove impurities. And this would have been a much celebrated truth about the increased factory production of steel, these giant Bessemers that kept getting bigger and bigger for the next 20 years to mass produce large amounts of steel. The Bessemer furnace was an important development in steel production, but the steel industry's influence on the public at large becomes essential for Cather's aesthetics that uses interruption to produce feeling. Paul's 20th century closet, a mass-produced basement and a clone of a house, is a powerful clone of a home, is a powerful image that Cather slows down the reader in which to consider. The pause allowed Paul to reflect on the lived experience of centralized spaces and rationalized life. And here's our last passage. Sorry, I must not have this on. I'll just read it. The pause allowed Paul to reflect the lived experience of centralized space and rationalized life. In such reactions, after one of the experiences which made days and nights of the dreary blanks of the calendar, which his senses were deadened, and Paul's head was always singularly clear. The feeling of the interruption intensifies Paul's, quote, reaction, allows the reader's experiences with the same challenges, the new monotony of labor, to be channeled into an understanding, the specific way heteronormative pressure functions on the same feeling channel produced by Fordized practices emerging as a cultural dominant. The dreary blank of the calendar, the day-to-day life is necessary condition for Cather's aesthetic to work, tapping into the new experiences of time and its impact on identity. And sorry for the interruption, but what I really just mean to say is that that particular passage about Paul, the dreariness of the calendar, that only works on an audience as they're being transformed. So her specific awareness of heteronormative pressure on this channel is kind of hitching a ride on the emotive channels being produced in the workforce at the time, as its logic extends through almost all forms of labor by the end of the 1920s. Cather's writing as it emerges as the new logic, which is what makes Paul's case cutting-edge aesthetics. Lastly, these debauches are in fact part of a larger consumption pattern that bolsters increased production. The second half of the narrative, which describes Paul's supposed escape from the pressure of industrial Pittsburgh to the glamour of the Astoria Hotel in New York, is in fact a repetition of the lived experiences of working and consuming, essential to Fordized Taylor's life. Paul's rebellion is the returning feeling circuit on what Juliet Squire will eventually call the work-spend cycle. Paul lives the good life that the magazines like Cather's Monthly or Cosmo or Saturday Evening Post detail. The Astoria was the most advertised hotel in these magazines at the turn of the century, and it should be filled with cool things and soft lights and fresh flowers that should restore Paul. But in fact, Cather would use the feelings of being associated with the increase in mass consumption to demonstrate the cool side of the water process, the water part of the purification process associated to steel production and Paul's identity. Paul's suicide does more than reveal how the harm of heteronormative pressure. It taps into the emotional withdrawal workers feel and how consumption is advertised as its cathexis. Paul's stream of consciousness right before his suicide reflects this cycle of work. Eventually lived experiences produces so many repetitive experiences that the purification process is internalized in the conscious identity of each person. Paul becomes our way of tapping into this now growing process by which we now are putting ourselves through our own kind of crucible and purifying ourselves, right? The way images and collections work. Right before Paul's suicide, he reflects on this exact moment. Paul states, the narrator states, Paul dismissed the carriage and walked, floundering along the tracks, his mind a medley of irrelevant things. He seemed to hold in his brain actual picture of everything he had seen that morning. He remembered every feature of both his drivers, of the toothless old woman from whom he had bought the red flowers in his coat, the agent from whom he had gotten a ticket, and all the fellow passengers on the ferry. His mind, unable to cope with the vital matters near at hand, worked feverishly and deftly at sorting and grouping these images. They made for him part of the ugliness of the world, of the ache of the head and the bitter burning on his tongue. He stooped and put a handful of snow into his mouth as he walked out, but that too seemed hot. This explains the weirdness of Paul's behavior at the end. The burying of the flower and him being hot, despite the fact that he's surrounded by snow, it's the closest direct expression to the faggoting of steel that Cather makes as part of this interruption. The new experience of the Fordized Taylor's world trains how the mind should, quote, deftly sort and group images, right? Because the repetition of a life is now being reduced to images in brief moments of feeling rather than complete events in one's experience. The woman whose labor helps Paul enjoy the flower is described as ugly, creating a sharp contrast between the beauty of the red carnation. And so here's a perfect microcosm of that work-spend cycle that's part of the purification process, or hot and cold, of Fordized Taylor's life, right? Where I work, then I'm cooled off by consumption, but this process is actually having this larger effect on my identity. The work-spend cycle is reduced to an imagistic emotive moment that repeatedly can be seen as an essential way the world, quote, becomes Cordelia Street, as the readers will have the same feelings and image grouping abilities as part of their real life experiences during the Fordized Taylor period. And I want to stop there. I think I'm close on time, so I don't want to keep going. But this is part of a larger process that we see, where advertising is now going to take advantage of mass periodicals. Mass periodicals are going to speak to people's desire and needs as they go, training them to solve problems through consumption, specifically related to centralized labor that's been rationalized for efficiency. Thank you so much for your interest in the presentation. I hope it made sense. It feels weird not being able to read a room, but we are all used to it. Thank you, and have a good day.
I hope that you enjoyed listening to our two papers for today. As I listened to these scholars, I was struck by how both Nathan and Miguel were drawn to themes of absence and interruption. As Nathan demonstrates in his paper, the insistence of several characters in the professor's house as situating native people and cultures as vanished or absent relies on several unfounded assumptions. Likewise, in Miguel's paper, we see the teachers and others around Paul making assumptions about his character and motivations in light of their own preferences for efficacy and standardization. In making their arguments, I appreciated how both Miguel and Nathan unpacked Cather's own aesthetics. They posed really interesting questions about how Cather, for example, might slow readers down in Paul's case, and about how her use of metaphor in the professor's house transforms natural spaces into ones that are built and shaped by humans. This panel invited our participants to consider the culture of the 1920s, and I appreciate how both the presenters examined institutions and movements from that era. I found myself thinking a lot about the role of advertising from Miguel's paper, for example, and thinking about the very modern, commercialized lives of Godfrey St. Peter and his family in the professor's house. I want to thank Nathan and Miguel for sharing their thought-provoking projects with us today. If you are interested in exploring the life and career of Willa Cather in more depth, you can find information about our upcoming conferences and events at the Willa Cather Foundation by visiting www.willacather.org. The Cather Project at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln also has several social media channels and our listserv, number 5 Bank Street, where you can also connect with other Cather scholars and find out information about conferences, events, and new research. We have 2 Cather panels this year at ALA, and I hope that you will check out our other panel on Willa Cather and her readers. There's a lot of interesting synergy between these 2 panels, especially concerning topics like Cather's connections to anthropology, the culture of the 1920s, and even her relationship to time that I hope you'll appreciate. Thanks for joining us, everyone.